In 1966, a controversy arose that led to radio stations across the U.S. to ban music by the Beatles from their airwaves. You are about to learn how this ban movement began, how it spread, and what was the aftermath. While the radio stations that banned the Beatles are often talked about as if they were only in the southern U.S., in reality they were all over the country. The first station to ban the Beatles as a result of this controversy was WAQY, or Wacky Radio, in Birmingham, Alabama on July 28, 1966. By August 2nd, 2 additional stations were reported to have joined the ban. By August 3rd, August 4th, August 5th, August 6th, August 7th, and by August 8th. When all was said and done, at least 140 radio stations banned the Beatles. Let's dig into how this all happened. While the Beatles were a global phenomenon in 1964, the pace of the band's output slowed in 1965 and 1966. The band's singles on the U.S. chart came at an astonishing frequency throughout 1964. As soon as I Want to Hold Your Hand entered the American chart on January 18, 1964, the Beatles had at least one song on the chart for 41 weeks, and as many as 14 songs on the chart at one time. Of the 104 weeks contained within 1964 and 1965, there were only 12 total weeks without a Beatles single among the 100 top songs in the U.S. Or, to put it another way, the Fab Four had at least one song on the chart for 88% of 64 and 65. But certainly by 1966, there were fewer new singles by the band hitting radio station airwaves, and there was definitely a lull in May 1966. People noticed this slower pace of hit songs and chalked it up to the Beatles losing their popularity. However, the Beatles were just on a different scale than most other artists. Glenn Miller and his orchestra had a jaw-dropping 45 singles on the chart in 1940 alone, and a 2-year combined total for 1940 and 41 of 70 songs. But apart from Miller, no artist from 1940 through 1965 except the Beatles had a 2-year span to that point with 46 songs on the chart. Elvis was the only rock and roll artist with a really good 2-year stretch of getting on the chart during this period. He managed 26 singles on the chart in 1956 and 57, but nowhere near the Beatles' 46. So when the Fab Four dropped down to just a very good amount of songs on the chart instead of a historic run, some people, especially those who didn't like the band and wished they would go away, began to speculate that their downfall had begun. And there were plenty of people who didn't like the Beatles and were eager to see their downfall. A columnist for the Ottawa Journal predicted at the start of 1965 that the Liverpool-originated Mersey sound would diminish that year, asking, "Are the Beatles on their way out?" Nope, that didn't happen. The same newspaper referenced their own incorrect columnist 18 months later with the headline reading, "He was wrong, but is the writing on the wall now?" Again, nope. And in a sidebar article, another writer suggested that based on turnover of youth loyalty, 1968 was the safe bet for the Beatles to no longer be so popular. And nope. Radio DJs reported to newspapers that the group was losing popularity. All through the first half of 1966, people kept reading tea leaves that the Fab Four were headed for the exits of pop culture's pantheon. Here, it was because of the supposed unpopularity of the Paperback Writer single, despite the fact that the song had topped the pop chart on both sides of the Atlantic. Maybe it was their hairstyle that was losing interest among young people. One teenager observed that you never hear ranting and raving about them any longer, and therefore perhaps they're running out of steam with the public. A teenage exchange student from England said that the Beatles were out and that the Rolling Stones were the big group now. Or maybe the new top group was the Turtles. In June 1966, a newspaper columnist referenced a recent report that the group was losing its creative touch and mocked their fans as suckers who forked over hundreds of thousands of dollars to them. The wellspring of people who vehemently disliked the Beatles ran deep, and this was nothing new. After Beatlemania began to sweep the United States, one editorial writer in Ohio lambasted the group's tight-fitting trousers and disgusting hairdos, and that will express no sorrow when they go back home. A Boston Globe writer declared in April 1964, "Someone has got to have the strength to walk into a room full of people and say, 'I hate the Beatles.'" Prior to the Fab Four's 1964 concert in the Denver area, a local reporter interviewed a lounge pianist/manager about what he thought of the Beatles.
Occasionally we have someone they ask me occasionally for a song, do one of the Beatles songs, and I've explained to them I just do music, so that's all I can do. Denver isn't that interested. I don't think any city is, but the young people, 14 and down, have been affected. That's all.
In June 1966, the Yesterday and Today album was released in North America. It was a compilation of songs not previously released in the U.S. The Beatles opted to use as cover art a photo of themselves wearing white lab coats and draped with plastic doll parts and cuts of meat. It was shot as part of an unusual photography session with a larger conceptual art theme, but the band claimed the photo for the Yesterday and Today album was somehow a statement on the Vietnam War. Advance copies of the album were sent to newspaper and magazine reviewers as well as to radio stations. Those receiving it were horrified and gave Capitol Records an earful about their distaste. The label decided to pull the plug on the cover and replace it with a more mundane cover photo, a move that cost $250,000. As a side note, the replacement cover was later used as evidence in the Paul is Dead hoax, when clue searchers realized that, tipped on its side, it could be interpreted as Paul in a coffin. But that will have to wait for a different Paul is Dead special report. The band's suggestion that the original cover was a commentary on the Vietnam War was possible, if a fairly opaque message to the world. John Lennon, for one, was giving a lot of thought about the war. Shortly after the Yesterday and Today album was released, John discussed the issue during a press conference while on tour in Japan. He said, "We think about the issue every day, and we don't agree with it. We think it's wrong." John's statement received some attention in the United States and led to at least one radio station to drop the Fab Four from its playlist. In March 1966, the London newspaper The Evening Standard published a series of interviews with each member of the Beatles. They were conducted by journalist Maureen Cleave, who was perhaps the first London music writer to feature the Beatles when she profiled them in February 1963. Cleave developed a rapport with the Fab Four and wrote about them frequently. She even traveled with them when the Beatles made their first trip to the U.S. to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show, so the band members felt familiar and comfortable speaking with Cleave. She published separate interviews in the Evening Standard with John, Paul, George, and Ringo, conducted at each man's home. They were published one a week for 4 weeks under the series title, How Does a Beatle Live? John's interview came first. In the article, the 25-year-old guitarist discussed his lifestyle since he moved to the posh suburbs among stockbrokers. He talked about his book collection, his laziness with physical tasks, and how he wanted his swimming pool to have a mirrored bottom. Cleave mentions that John was reading extensively about religion and quoted him saying, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I'll be proved right. We are more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." Maureen Cleave's interview with John was published on Friday, March 4th, 1966. On each subsequent Friday, an interview with another of the Fab Four was published. John's comments about Christianity then attracted no controversy. Datebook was a U.S. magazine aimed at teen girls, but in addition to the usual fluff one might expect from such a publication in 1966, it also published articles on serious subjects. It began existence as a typical teen magazine with advice about dating and celebrity news. After the explosive arrival of the Beatles to these shores in early 1964, the magazine began reshaping itself to ride the wave created by the Fab Four. But it also positioned itself as a magazine for the thinking teenager, with some unusual subjects for a publication featuring celebrity gossip. Readers were presented articles on interracial dating, critiques of patriarchy, information on how to join the civil rights-orientated Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and articles on Vietnam and marijuana legislation, all within the pages of a normal-looking magazine for teenagers. Interestingly, Datebook's managing editor was Danny Fields, who would later go on to manage the Stooges and the Ramones, so clearly he was interested in shaking up the status quo. Datebook bought the rights to reprint the Evening Standard Maureen Cleave articles about the Beatles. Lennon's more popular than Jesus comments had already been reported upon in the U.S. Newsweek mentioned it in late March, just a few weeks after the interview ran in London. And on July 3rd, the New York Times Magazine carried the interviews with the four Beatles, condensed into one article. This article also carried the key quotes from Lennon about religion, but again, they didn't seem to inflame anyone's outrage enough to do anything about it. Datebook included the Cleave interviews in their September issue, which went on sale on newsstands on July 29, 1966. Not only did the magazine reprint the articles, but they featured quotes on the cover seemingly designed to enrage some readers, or even those who saw it on a store's magazine rack, especially in southern states. And this time, someone did something about it. In the 1950s, Tommy Charles was a recording artist, a self-described baritone balladeer touring the country. The Chattanooga native settled in Birmingham and became a radio disc jockey, spinning popular instrumentals, light classics, show tunes, old standards, and a minimum of rock and roll. By 1962, Charles had teamed up with another DJ named Doug Layton. Layton served in the Navy and then began spinning records for top 40 radio stations in Alabama cities, including Anniston, Montgomery, and finally Birmingham. Charles and Layton became the morning and evening hosts on WYDE at 8:50 on the AM dial. The pair were a team, calling their program simply The Layton and Charles Show, and liked to joke around. To give you a sense of their humor, there was a local sports writer who invited a guest each week to predict the outcome of college football games, and when asked how Charles did so well picking winners, he quipped, "I just asked my old buddy Doug Layton who would win, and then picked the other way." The pair were described as one of Birmingham's most popular disc jockey teams. In late 1964, the team quit WYDE to launch a new station. Layton and Charles had gone in with two other investors to buy the former WEZB at 12:20 a.m. They rechristened it Wacky. WAQY were the call letters for the station, intended to be said as Wacky. The pair had a repertoire of fictional characters participating, including Judd and Clara Harrington, Bumps and Grinds O'Neill, and Walt the Swamp Man. Ooh, sounds hilarious. They sometimes performed skits that were labeled by listeners as abrasive. They described themselves as off-the-cuff cut-ups. Sources differ as to how Tommy Charles and Doug Layton at Wacky first saw the issue of Datebook magazine with Lennon's comments on religion. Datebook's managing editor Danny Fields later said that some mother in Alabama read it in her daughter's magazine and took it to a local radio station. Other sources say that the magazine's publisher, Art Unger, sent the magazine to radio stations around the Bible Belt. If true, that was no doubt a bid for notoriety. However it happened, the magazine and Lennon's interview did come to the attention of Layton and Charles on July 28, 1966. They began talking about the issue over the airwaves of Wacky Radio. Outraged, they banned the Beatles from their radio station. They conducted a telephone poll, and Charles said that 99% of callers supported the ban. As it happened, a reporter for United Press International, Alvin Ben, was in his car and was listening to Wacky. Ben called Charles and asked if this ban of the Beatles was serious or if it was another one of their comedy skits. They assured the reporter it was on the level. So Ben wrote up a story for the Newswire, including the radio host's intentions of having a bonfire to burn records, pictures, and clothing featuring the Beatles. When they made this announcement on Saturday, July 30th, they invited their listeners to send in their fab gear to be included in the blaze. Ben quoted Charles saying, "It's a shame because they're talented boys. They are as good or better than any group today, but we think it's time somebody stood up to them and told them to shut up." He added, "To them, nothing is sacred. They have a complete lack of breeding. A clod will show his colors when given a chance." Ben filed this story with his editors in Atlanta. They sent it on to UPI headquarters in New York, and it was quickly sent to media outlets across the country. UPI's rival wire service, the Associated Press, quickly wrote up their own story on the controversy, quoting Tommy Charles as saying, "We just felt it was so absurd and sacrilegious that something ought to be done to show them they cannot get away with this sort of thing." He added, "Almost unbelievably, the teenagers, almost as soon as they're sure it's true, become really angry, some to the point of tears." Charles made sure to let the AP reporter know that Wacky's ban was not for the sake of getting attention for his radio station. "I'm just mad about anyone making such a statement about Christianity." Not everyone believed Charles when he said publicity wasn't the goal when Wacky banned the Beatles. The general manager of WJHO in Opelika, Alabama, offered his perspective in an editorial aired on his own station. "We don't care one way or the other whether the Beatles records are played or not. The so-called Beatle ban was originated in Birmingham for the purpose of giving a relatively new radio station in Birmingham notoriety, and it's doing just that." All the wire service articles gave the controversy widespread attention, leading to local reporters around the country to contact their own area's radio stations and ask if those stations were also going to ban the Beatles. Sacrilegious remarks attributed to a member of the mop-haired British musical group known as the Beatles have evoked mixed reaction in Shreveport broadcasting circles, led off this Louisiana newspaper article, which went on to survey regional stations about whether they played or would continue to play the Beatles. It turns out that when reporters reached out, a couple of stations claimed to have already banned the Beatles before the whole "more popular than Jesus" comments were published in Datebook. KSVP in New Mexico had banned the Fab Four after the group spoke out against U.S. bombing in Vietnam. Another pair of co-owned radio stations in South Carolina apparently also banned the Fab Four. Their program director told a reporter, "The Beatles have been banned from our station for the past several months because we consider them to be unacceptable to many lovers of good music." KTLQ in Tahlequah, Oklahoma also claimed to have banned the Beatles months prior to the controversy over Lennon's comment, although a reason for stopping to play them was not given. It's worth noting here that radio stations in 1966 often didn't have the tightly focused formats found in today's radio. Many stations then were trying to serve most everyone in their community. They might have news and commentary mixed with music, as well as some shows aimed at a certain audience. They might have an hour or two in the afternoon, the evening, or on weekends that was programming for a teenage audience, and it might only be on a show for teens that a station played the Beatles. For example, the manager of KWHI in Brenham, Texas, said of his station, "We have only 1 hour a day set aside strictly for rock and roll." Or WSYB in Rutland, Vermont, which in 1966 only played rock and roll on a Saturday night program. WEZQ in Winfield, Alabama, similarly only played rock and roll from 2:30 to 6 p.m. weeknights. So when a station declared a ban on the Beatles in August of 1966, that declaration might not be affecting the station very much and often carried very little risk. The widespread newspaper accounts of Wacky's ban led to radio stations across the country to re-examine their airplay of the Beatles. Note that most U.S. radio stations did not ban the Beatles. But almost immediately after Wacky's ban was reported by wire services, other stations joined the campaign, or as many newspapers called it, jumping on the bandwagon. It was clear that the pent-up dislike of the Beatles was bursting through after cracks supposedly appearing in the Fab Four's popularity, and Wacky's ban gave detractors cover to let their hater flag fly. As an example, a newspaper columnist in Tipton, Indiana, devoted part of his column to the controversy in a section called "Stepping on the Insects." Lennon's statement, he wrote, led to a boycott of records by some disc jockeys, which we hope will be followed by others. Then he dropped his politeness mask entirely, stating, "In this day when things seem to be rather slipping in the Christianity department, there is small need to have such remarks made by a so-called intellectual who features a girlish bang haircut and somewhat loose morals." Some radio station staff were also letting their pent-up dislike of the Beatles out. The manager of KMHT in Marshall, Texas, declared, "I think we should have banned the records years ago in the interest of good music." In addition to banning the Fab Four's music from the radio, some stations felt they had to destroy their records by the Beatles to underscore their outrage. KHOB in Hobbs, New Mexico, announced their records were destroyed in a manner unknown. The manager of WYCL in York, South Carolina, broadcast an editorial on the station in which he states, "WYCL refuses to permit its facilities to be used by a group who so thoughtlessly and sacrilegiously have violated a public trust. The latest song by the Beatles, written in part by John Lennon, is destroyed." Presumably he was talking about Paperback Writer, which had hit #1 but was then dropping down the U.S. singles chart. Asserting that the song itself was destroyed and not just the physical copy is a bold claim. Since we can still listen to Paperback Writer today, that pretty strongly refutes it. Listeners were also reportedly getting in on the destruction. KBBB in Borger, Texas, recounted how at least one member of the audience had broken all of her personal Beatles records. DJs at KTFO in Seminole, Texas, were photographed by their local newspaper destroying records of the Beatles. In reality, they seem to be simply tossing them in a trash can, which is a pretty loose definition of destroying, in my opinion. WREV in Reidsville, North Carolina, had several of their DJs smash the records with sledgehammers, described as several hundred copies. They took care of the task in the station's lobby under the watchful eye of their station manager. Swinging sledgehammers in the station lobby seems a bit irresponsible and downright dangerous, but hey, the boss was right there, so no one got in trouble for it, I guess. Also, as we'll continue to see, safety was not first in many of these efforts. The music director of WHCQ in Spartanburg, South Carolina, broke his station's records by the Beatles with a hammer. At least that's what this obviously staged photo lets you believe. In reality, he looks a little frightened of hitting those records. WTTI in Dalton, Georgia, promised to break a record by the band on the air every time a listener, quote, refutes them by getting their Beatles-style haircut clipped off. There's one thing the Beatles feared professionally, it's refutation by trimmed tresses. But why exactly were stations banning the group from the airwaves. The station manager of WCRE in Cheraw, South Carolina, only said that the statement was a sort of blood-curdling thing. Most radio station spokespeople were very clear in being offended as Christians themselves or being worried about offending Christians in their audience. The general manager of WSLB in Ogdensburg, New York, said that he did not appreciate my child listening to any group that would condemn Christianity. Neither would I allow my audience to listen to such a group. The president and owner of KOKL in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, quoted here in a typo-filled mess, said that young listeners resent this effrontery to their Christian principles. A DJ for WNAM in Wisconsin made a very interesting declaration about the situation. He told a reporter that he won't play the Beatles after hearing about Lennon's comments. He said, "They could be criminals or dope pushers, but when they bring religion into their acts, they've gone too far, and they're washed up now as far as I'm concerned." The manager of WHWB in Rutland, Vermont, declared a ban of the Beatles, explaining, "Thousands of people died for the Christian religion, and a bunch of fellows with long hair shouldn't be allowed to mock it." The manager of WLEF in Greenwood, Mississippi, broadcast an editorial which insisted that there are many talented teenagers locally and internationally who are better musicians than the Beatles. So what do we need with the Beatles? These men who have attacked the very principles upon which this great nation was founded are no longer deserving the respect of the teenagers. But not every religious person saw John Lennon's comments as offensive, or at least not worthy of the music being banned. Louis Casals, a Sunday school teacher and longtime religion columnist for United Press International, reminded readers that irate Christians who are burning Beatles records might do well to pause between bonfires and read the New Testament. They would discover that vengeful acts of retaliation are a supremely inappropriate way of honoring Jesus Christ. Conservative writer William F. Buckley was no Beatles booster, but he opined that Lennon's controversial comments were accurate, actually, and an indictment of modern society. Others, including pastors, came to the same conclusion. But religious offense wasn't the only motivation for banning the Beatles. The program director of WXLI in Dublin, Georgia, implied that his motivation was that the band had gotten too much power in the music industry compared to local disc jockeys. He said that the band has forgotten that disc jockeys made them what they are today. They've bitten the hand that fed them, and that hand is now going to bite back. The manager of WTOT in Marianna, Florida, was not alone in wondering whether John Lennon's statements were part of a publicity stunt for the band to benefit themselves. A newspaper editorial writer in Benton Harbor, Michigan, also came to the same conclusion that it was all a calculated bid for attention. "This latest outburst by John Lennon," he wrote, "seems to be simply another outburst of unseemly conduct, possibly to attract attention in an effort to reverse the waning of their popularity." In a twist, some other radio managers suspected that the bands themselves were merely a publicity stunt by radio stations to gain visibility for themselves in announcing a ban. One writer of a letter to the editor in Cleveland, Mississippi, made that exact charge against a local radio station sponsoring a bonfire of Beatles material. He wrote, "This bonfire is mainly for publicity for a radio station and not to defend the holy name of Christ." A radio station in Virginia, WBTM, broadcast an editorial declaring a pox on the houses of both the Beatles and radio stations banning them. "We at WBTM," the editorial said, "will not beat our breast, tear our hair, nor gnash our teeth because the Beatles are profane. Neither will we join a growing army of broadcasters who themselves look for publicity through banishment of the Beatles." It went on, "From all over, we have entertainment on records performed by hopheads, rapists, thieves, and consorters with racketeers. The Beatles are only part of the picture." Lending credence to the notion that many radio station bans were a mere ploy for publicity, some radio stations that didn't even play the Beatles' music were announcing bans. Pampa, Texas radio station KBDN was reported to have banned the group. However, lower in the article, the station's owner admits, "They don't have to ban them. We never played them." WVAL in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota did a telephone poll of its listeners to see how many wanted to ban the Beatles. The band won the poll. The only problem is that WVAL played country western music and didn't play the Beatles on the station. WINF in Manchester, Connecticut started a Beatles Are Bad for Business Club, or BBB for short. They were a mostly talk station, but still had some Beatles records to throw away, despite likely not playing the group or hardly playing them. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Connecticut, Stamford station WSTC said it never played and never would play Beatles records, but still found a way to join the bandwagon. They banned music written by them, which may be performed by other groups. By the way, through 1965, there were already 15 songs written by Lennon and McCartney, but recorded by other artists that had made the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, half of which were top 40 hits, and 3 were top 10 hits. Plus, there were countless other non-charting covers of Beatles songs recorded to date. So WSTC wanted to hit them right in their songwriting royalties. records. KBEL in Idabel, Oklahoma did something similar. They not only banned songs made by the Beatles, but they also banned other recordings of all songs written by members of the group. Some stations gave themselves an easy out from their ban and just wanted to learn whether the quote was taken out of context. Others wanted to hear an apology from John Lennon. Many stations seemed to want to have their cake and eat it too, in that they wanted to look like they were doing something to punish the Beatles, but they also wanted to get back to the business of playing music their listeners wanted to hear, which definitely included the Fab Four. For example, Youngstown, Ohio's WHOT declared a ban until there was a satisfactory explanation for the statement. KNRO-FM in Conroe, Texas said that they would reconsider their ban if a public apology is made by a spokesman of the group. A DJ at KTEE in Idaho Falls, Idaho said their ban would continue until John Lennon retracts his Antichrist statement. WAKR in Akron, Ohio made the length of their ban rather vague. They said their ban will continue until such time as it's in the public interest to play them again, also known as whenever we again feel like it. WLCB in Moulton, Georgia was oddly specific in declaring the length of their ban. They said, no more Beatles records are to be played on our station, not for the next 10 or 12 years anyway. Bryan, Ohio's WBNO extended their ban to include record hops sponsored by the station. Its length was declared permanent. KWFR in San Angelo, Texas told the press that the Beatles were banned immediately and forever. KFWR further said an apology from the Beatles will not rectify their situation. Across town in San Angelo, the station KTEO amped it up further. We don't care if they come out with 10,000 apologies. We will not play the Beatles again. As it turned out, this station's principled stand might not have been as much of a sacrifice as it might have seemed. Mere days after declaring their ban, KTEO announced they were changing formats and would subsequently have a town and country format, so probably not much Beatles music was in their future anyway. KNOE of Monroe, Louisiana declared their ban was to last indefinitely. But it's hard to beat KZEE in Weatherford, Texas, who insisted they were banning the Beatles eternally. On the other end of the spectrum, some stations were pretty wishy-washy about their bans. WFLS in Fredericksburg, Virginia wasn't sure they would have an out-and-out ban, but they said Beatles records would definitely not be played as much. KVIC in Victoria, Texas played word games with their policy. We have not banned them, said their sales manager, but we have quit playing their records. While WYNA in Raleigh, North Carolina announced a bonfire to burn Beatles records and memorabilia, on the air they seemed more hesitant. Their manager and co-owner said they would ask their listeners not to request the songs, but probably would play them if urged. Now that's taking a stand. To call attention to their ban, some radio stations played something else instead of the Beatles. WAKY in Louisville, Kentucky, for example, was offering listeners 10 seconds of silence instead of the, quote, current Beatles record, likely meaning Paperback Writer. And WAUC in Wauchula, Florida, played gospel music instead of the Beatles. Some stations insisted on making their decisions without public comment. For example, KEYS in Corpus Christi, Texas, was asked by a reporter about whether they were banning the Beatles. Their program director said, no matter which way we finally decide, we're not going to make a public display. I think the Birmingham station was wrong to burn or break the records publicly. We'll either play them or stop playing them without fanfare. He added, it's in poor taste to use the religious feelings of the American people for sensationalism and publicity. Similarly, the general manager of WBTM in Danville, North Carolina, said they probably would ban the group, but they wouldn't make any hullabaloo about it. Some people thought that bans by radio stations were too limited to properly deal with the Beatles in that moment. A representative from WGAT in Gate City, Virginia said, even the teens around this area are going along with what I say, that the Beatles should be banned from the United States. A Pennsylvania state senator announced he would introduce a resolution to discourage support of the Beatles in the Keystone State. His resolution called on talent agents in the state to refuse to book them and to cancel any engagements already made. Further, it asked radio and television stations to stop playing the band's music. Finally, it called on jukebox operators to remove Beatles singles from their machines. While some of the people issuing bans of the Beatles' music were practically gleeful in their disdain, many others expressed great disappointment in John Lennon's statements with an implied tisk-tisk and heavy sigh. The station manager of KWFR in San Angelo, Texas, told a reporter, personally, I think they are talented young men, but was quick to add, I wish they would get a haircut, though. A DJ at WDSP in Defuniak Springs, Florida, told a reporter that he broke 7 of the Beatles' biggest hits while on the air, but he also lamented, and Paperback Writer was real hot. Yeah. The program director for WHKP in Hendersonville, South Carolina, thought that Lennon's comments besmirched the good name of all Beatles fans. He said, "The statement not only reflects upon the group, but on all of us who at one time or another thought that the Beatles were number one forever." Aww. WNOS in High Point, North Carolina didn't ban the Beatles, but would subsequently play them only upon request. The station's manager said, "We shall play them when the public demands, but they will not be presented with pleasure as they once were." He added, "The Beatles are worth saving, and for the sake of their fans, we hope they will be. The Beatles can still be an influence for good. We hope someone near them will show them the way." Supporters of the Beatles didn't always sit by quietly when radio stations banned the group from their airwaves. Teen fans in Columbus, Ohio picketed WCOL after that station banned the Fab Four. One picket sign read, "Jesus had long hair too." Sometimes stations dealt with name-calling by Beatles fans. The operations manager for the unfortunately named WCUM in Cumberland, Maryland, reported that they had been called intellectual slobs and religious bigots. He made sure to add that they also had been called saints, primarily by adult listeners. KFIF in Tucson, Arizona, polled its listeners about banning the group, and fans strongly supported continuing to play the Beatles by a 10-1 margin. Then, said the station's manager, they received a bomb threat from a man who said he would give the station 3 days to stop playing Beatle music or he would, quote, mail you a bomb. That wasn't the only instance of a Beatles hater threatening violence. WFLI of Chattanooga, Tennessee had already banned the Fab Four from their airwaves and received a letter from a listener which threatened to blow the station up if they went back to playing the Beatles. Beatles supporters could resort to more extreme measures as well. KLUE in Longview, Texas found their building vandalized after banning the Fab Four. According to local reports, a pro-Beatle group attacked KLUE with paintbrushes after hours and painted the inscription, "Yay Beatles," along with several obscene remarks on the station's outside walls. The article went on to suggest a West Side Story situation was brewing for the following Friday night when pro-Beatle groups were planning on demonstrating in support of the Beatles, while a large number of Ban the Beatles fans would also be on hand. Well, when you're a jet all the way. The program director of KSWO in Lawton, Oklahoma, reported that after banning the Beatles, angry fans of the group threatened anything from kicking down the door of the station to killing him personally. He added that in the choice between the popularity of the Christian religion and the popularity of the Beatles, need I say, judging by the telephone calls and letters, the choice has been the Beatles. WYNA in Raleigh, North Carolina banned the Fab Four and planned a bonfire of Beatles materials, and the co-owner reported that the station had received numerous irate telephone calls, some promising possible violence at the burning. And note that teenagers weren't always on the Beatles' side in this dispute. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, WLAV chose not to ban the group. A handful of teens and tweens picketed the station for continuing to play the Beatles. Perhaps the most shocking instance of a radio station banning the Beatles was by WABC in New York City. On August 13, 1966, Billboard magazine published that WABC has reportedly put Beatles records on the verboten list, but at press time, the switchboard operator at the station said that not one of the station staff members could be reached. If true, this was quite a development for a station that 2 years previously referred to itself as WABC.
This week, WABC proudly presents these Beatles spectacular sounds.
They even made a series of jingles to try to connect WABC and the Beatles in listeners' minds.
It's time to hear a brand new Beatles hit. Coming at you from 77 WABC.
It was apparently correct that WABC had imposed a ban on the Fab Four. On August 17th, an Associated Press report included WABC in a list of stations that rescinded their bans. Hard to believe, but there it is. Back on Saturday, July 30th, 1966, when Tommy Charles and Doug Layton on Wacky started the whole controversy, they announced that they were accepting Beatles albums and souvenirs and would hold a giant Beatle bonfire the night they are closest to Birmingham on their upcoming American tour, probably when they are in Memphis on August 19th. Many radio stations didn't just follow Wacky's lead in banning the Beatles, they also announced their own bonfires. We don't know too much about some bonfires. WMTM in Moultrie, Georgia held a bonfire to burn Beatles records on August 12th, 1966. All we know about that burning is that the station DJ'd the event with music by rock and roll groups except for the Beatles, and that around 200 teenagers attended. WPXE in Stark, Florida held a bonfire on Friday, August 5th. As the Fort Pierce News-Tribune reported,
all of Stark Station WPXE's Beatle records wilted and went up in pungent smoke Friday night in a bonfire station officials kindled as 300 teenagers and parents looked on. Some of the material for the bonfire outside the studio was contributed by former Beatles fans. Sweatshirts, buttons, photos of the mop-top British rock and rollers. Program director Mark Edwards called Lennon's quoted statements sacrilegious.
WIBR in Baton Rouge, Louisiana held a bonfire on Saturday, August 6, 1966 at 10 a.m. Central Time. One newspaper account said that WIBR had put together a nice-sized stack of Beatles memorabilia, including albums, scrapbooks, posters, games, a sweatshirt or two, and at least one wig. The Daily World newspaper in Opelousas, Louisiana reported on the bonfire.
An 8-foot-high stack of Beatle records, scrapbooks, and other Beatle things went up in smoke Saturday before an appreciative crowd of 400 persons, mostly teenagers. The pyre was topped by a Beatle wig and soaked with kerosene before it was fired. Radio station WIBR sponsored the Beatle burning. Brian Wilson, WIBR disc jockey, said a band of pro-Beatle teens had threatened to picket the event, but they never showed up. Wilson said he had received a phone call from an anonymous young lady who told him, "I guess we ought to start burning Bibles now."
Another report in the Lake Charles American Press gave further detail.
Grandmothers, teenagers, and preschool children were among a crowd of about 200 who watched Beatle records, wigs, magazines, and pictures burned at a vacant lot today. "I think it's wonderful," said one mother. "I'm glad to see my money burned. The next haircut I get won't be a Beatle haircut," a 12-year-old student said. Some in the crowd thought the burning was useless, saying the Beatles had a right to their views.
WLEF in Greenwood, Mississippi announced they were holding a bonfire on Friday, August 19th when the Beatles were scheduled to perform in Memphis, their only concert date in the U.S. South on that tour. The staged conflagration was to include what the newspaper report said was Beatles records, etc., etc., and etc. Greenwood is situated at the confluence of the Tallahatchie and Yallabusha rivers, which forms the Yazoo River. WLEF's bonfire would take place on the banks of the Yazoo River, and the station will dump the remains in the Yazoo. It's worth noting here that vinyl records are made of various fun ingredients like chlorine, acetic acid, and ethylene, which is also used in antifreeze. Ingestion of any of these ingredients could be a medical emergency, and burning records can produce materials highly toxic to humans, including hydrogen chloride gas and dioxins. While 1966 was a simpler time in how we understood pollution and its effect on health, many of these bonfires of Beatles items turned out to be an exercise in attempting to purify society spiritually by poisoning it physically. One WLEF official declared, "The management of this station and I feel the Beatles are a bunch of smart alecks." He reported that the collection of Beatles materials from local teenagers has been small, but he hoped the kids would continue to send in more records to burn. On the very same newspaper page that WLEF reported that record donations were sparse, the newspaper ran several letters from local teenagers. One girl named Susie James told readers that burning records by the Beatles was way out of proportion and asked her community, take into consideration something one's boss, next-door neighbor, or friend has said. Isn't there proof that their thought isn't heaven-bound? Do you carry hate or scorn over your face when you see them? Or do you cover it up, try to forgive them? I hope you try to forgive them. Gee, talk about smart alecks. As was written in the book of Isaiah, and a little child shall lead them. WKAC in Athens, Alabama held a bonfire on Friday, August 5th, 1966, as reported in the Decatur Daily newspaper.
With the apparent blessing of Police Commissioner F.S. Hunt, Band the Beatle advocates will stage a Beatle burning tonight in the Decatur Boat Harbor. The huge bonfire to burn records by the Mopped Hairs singing group will start at 8 p.m., according to Jerry Sharp, an Athens radio station disc jockey who organized it. Sharp of radio station WKAC said he has received over 265 calls in a 2-hour period supporting his boycott of the Beatles records, and only 6 requests to play them. My listeners are behind me 100%.
DJ Jerry Sharp there displaying a misunderstanding of how percentages work. 265 calls in a 2-hour period were anti-Beatles, 6 calls were pro-Beatles. That's a total of 271 calls on the subject. 6 divided by 271 gets you the pro-Beatles percentage, which was 2%. That means the anti-Beatles percentage was 98%. Since Jerry Sharp was anti-Beatles, his listeners were behind him 98%. Anyway, the article continued.
City Commissioner Hunt said, "I wasn't aware of this movement until just now, but as far as I'm concerned, they can burn all the Beatle records they want." Pack Self, Chief of Police, and Buddy Evans, Limestone County Sheriff, have given the go-ahead with the Beatle burning, according to the Athens disc jockey.
Here is a photo taken at the bonfire event. The reporter clearly wrote with relish about the absurdities he witnessed.
Mostly the young and curious onlookers gathered last night at the Decatur Boat Harbor to witness the newest teenage fad, a Beatle burning. But in the lingo of the teenager set, it was a hard day's night for Beatle record burners. For one thing, Beatle records were scarce. Sharp had brought along a large number of his own and some that had been donated by his listeners in Athens. But as the night wore on, only a handful of young people came forward to add more records to the stack. One teenager who declined to be identified commented, "I'm just here to watch. I wouldn't burn my Beatle records for anything." Another teenager was heard to exclaim, "But mother, I don't want to burn my Beatles records." To which the mother replied, "Shut up and burn them." When Sharp realized he wasn't going to get any more records, he said, "Well, guess that's all." By this time, most of the crowd had begun to drift towards their automobiles, and Sharp kicked wet sand on the smoldering heap. If anything was proved at the Decatur Boat Harbor last night, it was that the magic of the Beatles will draw a crowd anywhere.
In some locations, a bonfire was planned without the involvement of a radio station. On Saturday, August 6th, a bonfire took place at 5 p.m. in Alexandria, Louisiana, that was reportedly organized by local teenagers. According to the local newspaper, the Town Talk,
a crowd of approximately 500 gathered in Bringhurst Park Saturday afternoon to witness the burning of records, pictures, magazines, sweatshirts, and other items connected with the Beatles. The crowd, largely composed of teenagers, included quite a number of adult spectators and youngsters. Members of the Alexandria Police and Fire Department were also on hand to supervise the burning. One man arrived carrying a load of records and magazines. "I'm burning the Beatles and the Hermits and all those mopheads," he told bystanders. "This is the first time I've enjoyed burning money," commented a woman as she added her share of fuel to the fire. The words "Down with Beatles" were painted on a car windshield. A pair of Beatles supporters arrived on the scene, one wearing a sweatshirt bearing the words, "I love the Beatles." They were greeted by booing, name-calling, and cries of "Atheists, they're atheists." Joined by a handful of friends, the pair went through the bleachers at the ballpark in search of forgotten records and magazines. Finally, they attempted to retrieve from the fire what mementos they could of their idols. The group cheered as flames consumed the Beatles items they had brought. Several teenagers happily shredded the magazines and photographs before adding them to the bonfire, while others made a game of sailing the platters into the flames. Firemen were forced to douse the flames when players began arriving for the Little League baseball game scheduled for Saturday night.
In Indianapolis, according to the newspaper The Daily Journal in Franklin Greenwood, Indiana, a Beatle burning, sponsored by a Catholic youth organization unit, was marred Tuesday night by the arrest of two teenage boys who tried to put out a bonfire with extinguishers. The CYO unit from St. Catherine of Siena Church threw Beatle records and other souvenirs into the fire on the church grounds, with about 1,000 teenagers and a handful of adults participating. Police arrested two brothers, 14 and 15 years old, on charges of disorderly conduct and taunting an officer. Patrolman Timothy G. Hayes said the boys were among a group of 6 or 7 youths carrying fire extinguishers. The youths shouted they were out to get David M. Kirch, 16, the junior CYO unit president. While teenagers waved signs such as "Long Live God" and "Down with John Lennon," Kirch told the gathering the Beatles statement was an insult because "we are the future Christians." As Kirch and the other leaders of the CYO unit lit the fire, hundreds of teenagers threw in their records and Beatle magazines. Some cries of "Bring the fire extinguishers" and "Long live the Beatles" were heard, however. The arrested youths used foul language and threatened Patrolman Hayes. Both were sent to the police department's juvenile division. And now we head to Belton, South Carolina, and a bonfire that took place on Saturday, August 6th. A pyre of Beatle records and memorabilia was torched into a 10-foot flame surrounded by some 200 contributors on the outskirts of town here Saturday. Reverend J.C. Dyer of the Belton Second Baptist Church offered a prayer before the fire was set. He told the Greenville News Saturday night Lennon's comment was the most sacrilegious, blasphemous, and discreditable statement ever made. More blasphemous than Lucifer's declaration non-serviam? That was Lucifer stating he would not serve God, and that's what got him cast into hell. According to Reverend Dyer, John Lennon's musings were worse.
4 balloon effigies of the Beatles with mops for hair straddled the top of a pile of limbs, leaves, and old tires. The debris was soaked with gasoline and ignited. An imitation devil placed beside the pyre carried a sign which mocked, "I've come to take you all away." One teenager, a former fan of the singing group, told the news that she felt the American people had made them, and she couldn't imagine anyone feeling that way. She fed the fire with 5 albums. "I think they should have all their tours canceled in America," Janice Broom, 14, a sponsor of the burning, told the news. Reverend Dyer said he also hoped that public indignation would result in the group being banned from America. "I think we've got a good start. I really do," he said. Another Beatle bonfire will be set at the Salem Baptist Church in Anderson Sunday at 2:30 p.m.
And, of course, the KKK had an opinion on all this. The Alabama Klan said, "I'm glad to see the boycott. We brought it out in the past about the atheistic views of a few of them," meaning the Beatles. The Mississippi Klan asked teenagers to cut their wigs off and send them to be burned in a KKK bonfire. On Tuesday, August 9th, the Ku Klux Klan had a burning, tossing records by the Beatles into the flames of a burning cross during a rally. Robed Klansmen held their rally near Chester, South Carolina. Bob Scoggin of Spartanburg, the South Carolina Grand Dragon, led the anti-Beatle demonstration before about 150 persons. Scoggin called the rock and roll singers the Beagles. Also, the Klan chieftain attacked a local radio station, which he said refused to sell time to publicize the rally. Just so you can follow this, the Klan used the radio station ban of the Beatles to promote their own agenda, but were angry that a radio station ban of Klan advertising was preventing them from promoting their own agenda. That's the thing about irony. It's pretty ironic. And now, the curious case of Clue. On Friday, August 12, 1966, KLUE Radio, Clue, in Longview, Texas, held a bonfire. Earlier that day, the Longview Daily News reported,
Former Beatles fans of Longview and the East Texas area are expected to gather at Clue Radio Station at the intersection of Highway 149 and FM Road 1845 in Longview tonight to burn thousands of records and other symbols of Beatlemania. The kids are still calling and are planning to come to the bonfire tonight, rain or no rain, said Program Director Mike Mitchell at noon today. To further support our stand against the statements of John Lennon that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus, we have investigated and gathered more evidence to substantiate our belief that he did indeed make the marks attributed to him. Mitchell quoted a 1964 article in a popular magazine as saying that the rude, profane, and vulgar boys from Liverpool are so anti-Christ that they shock other persons claiming to be anti-Christ also.
That wasn't just hyperbole by Mitchell. 2 years previously, the Fab Four press officer Derek Taylor told the Saturday Evening Post, "Here are these 4 boys from Liverpool. They're rude, they're profane, they're vulgar, and they've taken over the world. It's as if they founded a new religion. They're completely anti-Christ. I mean, I'm anti-Christ as well, but they're so anti-Christ, they shock me." It's a quote that has been cited perennially since it was published by religiously motivated Beatles haters as proof of the offensiveness of the band and their music. At Clue's bonfire, according to the Longview Daily News,
Beatle-burning teenagers, joined by a surprising number of adults, turned a huge pile of Beatle lore, records, and pictures into a pile of ashes near the radio station Clue Tower Friday night. Donna Woods of Longview volunteered to set flame to the big pile and came away with a smile. City Police Captain Jack Gatlin reported that cars parked in the vicinity of the radio station south of the city were so snarled it took more than an hour for the drivers to manipulate tight turns and clear the area. An estimated 1,000 youngsters and adults crowded around the big blaze, and another 2,000 or 3,000 cruised past the point in cars. A surprising aspect was that most spectators gathered around the big fire without a word. Those dedicated to showing the Beatles crew the back of their hands remained calm and collected as flames seared the pile of record albums and pictures. "It's a smash," one youth remarked quietly as heat from the fire warmed his face. "There isn't anyone or anything as popular as those Beatles think they are." Tony Bridge, station owner, joined the campaign along with his staff members. He, too, was one of the spectators Friday evening. Lowell Wolf, station manager, aided Miss Woods at the bonfire, spreading kerosene on the pile. A report on the bonfire in the Shreveport Journal added, "About 7,500 youngsters watched as a 25-foot pile of lumber, Beatles records, and Beatle paraphernalia went up in flames and smoke. About 150 of the teenagers at the bonfire said they still remain true to the popular music group." But the reputation of the Beatles in some circles had diminished enough that a local movie theater in Longview ran a newspaper ad for a Herman's Hermits movie with the text, "Ex-Beatle fans, come join our club."
But something curious happened to Clue the day after they burned records by the Beatles. According to the Longview Daily News,
Clue was knocked off the air when a bolt of lightning struck the tall transmission tower. Lowell Wolf, manager, said Phil Ransom, news director, was knocked unconscious when the lightning coursed into the building and was rushed to Good Shepherd Hospital. He said Ransom regained consciousness shortly afterward and was believed in good condition. Wolf said the lightning caused extensive damage to radio equipment, but it was hoped the station would resume regular broadcasts that day.
maybe the destructive lightning was a complete coincidence. Maybe God was displeased by Clue's actions burning the Beatles. Or maybe it had nothing to do with the Beatles and had to do with advertisements like this one. Under the header, How to Make Love to Your Wife, Clue told husbands, "Tomorrow morning, before you leave for the office, set her radio dial to Clue. She'll enjoy our more music, less gab policy. So don't be surprised if you find candles on the dinner table. Expect them." While bonfires were a very visible and public way to destroy records by the Beatles, other types of major destruction were also used to show disapproval of the band. On Saturday, July 30th, 1966, after Birmingham radio station Wacky started the whole Ban the Beatles movement, station co-owners and DJs Tommy Charles and Doug Layton announced that they were collecting Beatles records and memorabilia to burn it in what Charles called a giant Beatle bonfire. But less than a week later, it almost seemed like the pair were tiring of the movement that they started. They said they may reconsider if the Beatles apologize. "We're not out to destroy them," Charles told a reporter. "We just want to answer them." Local newspapers reported that Wacky had canceled their giant Beatle bonfire. According to wire service reports published in Australia and England,
hundreds of Beatles records are to be pulverized in a giant municipal tree grinding machine here. After going through the Beatle grinder, borrowed from Birmingham City Council, all that will be left of the records will be fine dust. A box full of this will be presented to the British pop stars when they arrive in Memphis for a concert on August 19th. Disc jockey Jim Cooper of Wacky said on August 7th, "We'll invite the public along and grind the records to dust ceremonially." Cooper and colleagues Tommy Charles and Doug Layton aim to hire the city's tree grinding machine used to chew up branches from pruned trees to do the job.
They told a slightly different story to the Birmingham News.
Tommy Charles said, "The call for Beatle records to destroy has resulted in several thousand being mailed to radio station Wacky, where he and Layton are employed." Charles said the records will be crushed with a 10-horsepower meat grinder, probably early next week at some public place. Charles said the records, crushed into fine powder, will be boxed and sent to the Beatles in England. Collect. He said a number of emotionally moved teenagers have called the station to declare they're giving up religion. This was also reflected in letters to the station, he said, adding, "I can show you some letters up here that would scare the life out of you." Charles said the Beatles have a right to hold unorthodox religious views, but must be responsible for the consequences of stating them publicly. A ban of their records is one of the legitimate consequences, he said.
Not everyone in Birmingham agreed. A columnist in the Birmingham News who was obviously not a Beatles fan also noted, "I confess that I have reservations about any bans. The notion that unpopular ideas can or should be destroyed in the flames of a fire or shredded to bits in a garbage grinder is unsettling. It's unknown if Wacky went through with their grinder destruction of Beatles material." KOBH in Hot Springs, South Dakota decided to destroy their records by the Beatles using a different but still unusual method. According to the Brandon Sun,
records of the Beatles, which a radio station here has in its library, are going to be used as clay pigeons in a trap shoot, at which winners will be awarded rings of bologna. Del Brandt of station KOBH said Friday the station's offer of all of its Beatles records had been accepted by the Hot Springs Gun Club and will be used at the club's shoot August 18th.
Added the Sioux Falls Argus leader,
Brandt said the station has at least 25 records of the British group. The records will be tossed up by hand as targets. There will be winners in each of several divisions, and each winner will get a piece of bologna.
It wasn't only radio stations finding novel ways to destroy their records by the Beatles. This 10-year-old boy in Jonestown, Mississippi turned his records into an archery target. In Arcadia, California, a woman was incensed about Lennon's statements, so she enlisted some neighborhood children to break Beatles records. 3 boys signed up for the destruction to be held on the woman's front lawn on Friday, August 12, 1966 at noon. The only problem is that neither the woman nor the children had any Beatles records to smash. The newspaper report said, all disillusioned Beatles fans are invited to attend and bring plenty of records. In an ugly turn of events, in the night prior to the planned record breaking, the woman's house was egged and 2 windows were broken by rocks. The woman canceled the record destruction, although the kids declared that they would go ahead themselves with smashing 5 records that had been donated for the project. It wasn't just radio stations that joined the Beatles ban. During the whole More Popular Than Jesus furor, TV stations across the country were airing the Beatles cartoon, usually on Saturday morning, and most TV stations kept carefully mum about the controversy, except for WDEF in Chattanooga, Tennessee. According to the Tennessean newspaper,
a Chattanooga television station has canceled a half-hour show on the Beatles scheduled for Sunday. Morris Quave, program director of WDEF-TV, said the decision was my own, and that he felt this would not be the proper time for a show featuring the British group.
While the movie Help, starring the Beatles, was released a year prior in the summer of '65, theaters and drive-ins were frequently bringing it back for return screenings. The Rockingham Theater in Reidsville, North Carolina, canceled a run of Help due to Lennon's comments. And the Land Sun Theater in Artesia, New Mexico, did the same. In Bruton, Mississippi, a record distributor took all Beatles records out of about 30 jukeboxes. The Corpus Christi branch of the USO, the nonprofit that provides entertainment for members of the military, banned all Beatles records from being played at USO events. Also, all Beatles records that people let the USO use on loan had to be removed from the USO premises ASAP, according to the director of that USO branch. Any records not picked up would be destroyed. The Daily Times News in Burlington, North Carolina reported that a local band called The Legends, which was managed by a member of the police department, announced that they would be banning songs by the Beatles from their set lists. The South Carolina newspaper The Greenville News reported,
the Tanglefoot Club, a teenage organization here, has voted to boycott all radio stations that play Beatle music. Club members will stage a bonfire Saturday at 6:30 p.m. in front of their center to burn Beatle records and pictures. The club has a membership of more than 600. Bill Reeves, manager of the Teen Center, said the various bands that perform every Saturday at the club will be asked not to play Beatle music. Reeves said the club feels that the Beatles should not be allowed to come back to America.
Meanwhile, in Alton, Illinois, the Alton Telegraph reported,
an Alton posse of youngsters hanged the British entertainers in effigy this morning. The young hangers obtained the effigies from a scrap heap where they had been thrown by the operators of a neighborhood store. One of the owners of the store, Wegener's Grocery, said the store had tossed out its balloon figures of the Beatles and had removed all the Beatle records from its record display until they retract that statement. In the meantime, air seeps out of the 4 Beatle figures hanged this morning.
Although radio stations banning the Beatles was largely a U.S. phenomenon, the movement did creep abroad. There is some evidence of at least 4 Canadian radio stations instituting a ban, and in the Netherlands, the NCRV Protestant Broadcasting Association kicked the Beatles off of their airwaves. Radio Raquette in Pamplona, Spain, declared a ban on the Fab Four until Lennon withdrew his remarks. Apparently, other radio stations there followed suit. In a brief newspaper dispatch about a movie theater in Pamplona canceling a screening of Help over Lennon's statement, it mentioned that a total of 3 local radio stations had banned the group. In South Africa, the State Broadcasting Corporation threatened to ban the Beatles unless a satisfactory explanation is immediately forthcoming. The South African Broadcasting Corporation, the only broadcaster in the country, announced it followed through on its threat to ban the group. The chairman of the corporation's board of governors said it will not lend its services to fostering the image of this group in our country. Further, their ban extended to compositions by the Beatles recorded by other musicians. A province of the Philippines, Laguna, which news reports say was known for its religious fervor, was also attempting to ban the Beatles. In an ironic twist given so many radio bans, radio stations in Manila, which broadcast into Laguna, said they were not planning on banning music by the Beatles. So how did the Beatles and their representatives respond when the uproar first occurred over John Lennon's statements on Christianity? A spokesman for Capitol Records, which distributed the Beatles in the United States, rushed to Lennon's defense, declaring the pensive Beatle was quoted out of context and misconstrued. The spokesman said Lennon's remarks were conjectural on the topics of Christianity, rock and roll, and other institutions subject to change over the years. Lennon only intended the broadest possible comparison between the rock and roll movement and the institution of Christianity as it relates to the trend to nonconformity among contemporary youth. The Capitol spokesman concluded he definitely intended no irreverence. Walter Shenson, the producer of both the A Hard Day's Night and Help films, gave a quote to a reporter in defense of the Beatles. "I know all the boys well," he said. "I also know them as not irreverent and not irreligious, but I also know them to be honest unto themselves." Initially, the Beatles camp issued a no-comment response to press inquiries. This did nothing to bury the story, as reporters across the U.S. were having a field day calling up their local stations and reporting which, if any, were banning the Beatles. All the inquiries from reporters likely led to more radio bans, which led to more stories about news stations joining the bandwagon, and fed into a cycle for some days of attention leading to more radio bans, leading to more attention to the controversy. Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, would no doubt at this time be dealing with the myriad details involving the band's upcoming 19-date U.S. tour due to start in Chicago on August 12th. Additionally, Epstein had just been named in a music industry lawsuit. While it involved his other business interests and had nothing to do with the Beatles, it was another distraction for him. So when word of the movement to ban the Beatles reached Epstein, it was likely the last thing he wanted to deal with. He decided to fly to New York to do what he could in calming the choppy waters ahead of the arrival of the Fab Four. But while it was initially reported that he had to end a European vacation to come to the U.S., in reality, Epstein had been in the resort of Port Merion, Wales for several weeks recovering from glandular fever, also known as mononucleosis. A friend told a reporter he's a sick man. Maureen Cleave, the UK journalist who originally interviewed Lennon and wrote about his comments on religion, Christ, and Christianity, spoke out to defend Lennon. He actually deplores the fact that some people know the Beatles better than they know Christ. "I do not think for one moment that he intended to be flippant or irreverent. He was certainly not comparing the Beatles with Christ. I am astonished that John's quotation should be taken out of the context of my article and misinterpreted in this way." The interview, which took place and which appeared in British and also in some American newspapers 5 months ago, dealt briefly with the subject of religion. Upon arriving in New York City, Brian Epstein gave a press conference at the Americana Hotel. He insisted in a prepared statement that the quote which John Lennon made to a London columnist more than 3 months ago has been quoted and represented entirely out of context. He did not mean to boast about the Beatles' fame. He meant to point out that the Beatles' effect appeared to be a more immediate one upon certainly the younger generation. John is deeply concerned and regrets that people with certain religious beliefs should have been offended in any way. Epstein declared that the Beatles had no intention of calling off their American tour, and that they would arrive in Chicago as scheduled on August 11th. He, however, expressed some concerns about their security during the tour, as this has upset a great many Americans. On August 11th, the Beatles traveled across the Atlantic, touched down in Boston, and then immediately flew to Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Care was given to avoid throngs of screaming fans this time, unlike past visits to the U.S. At a press conference in Chicago, John was visibly uncomfortable as he meandered his way through an explanation and apology about his statements on Christianity. I'm sorry I said it, really. I never meant it as a lousy anti-religious thing. I wasn't saying whatever they're saying I was saying. I was sort of deploring the attitude toward Christianity." Lennon being Lennon, he made a wry observation. "I suppose if I had said television was more popular than Jesus, I would have got away with it. I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. I was not knocking it. I was not saying that we are greater or better." Some radio stations used the apology as an off-ramp to end their ban of the Beatles. Others partially accepted it, like Wacky in Birmingham, which said they were calling off their bonfire. However, they continued their ban of the music. The manager of WLEF in Greenwood, Mississippi, wasn't swayed at all by Lennon's apology. He said, "The management of this station and I feel that the Beatles are a bunch of smart alecks, and although they say they are sorry, we still feel that they are only apologizing now because of fear it might hurt them financially. We are still going to ban playing their records." The 8th date on the Beatles' 1966 U.S. tour was in Memphis on August 19th. It was the only stop in the U.S. South, and as such, it had been used as a point of protest for many radio stations in that region of the country. According to the Kingport Times in Tennessee,
ticket sales dropped slightly during the height of the religious controversy, but picked up sharply the days immediately preceding the quartet's performances.
The concert's promoters said,
"The controversy is apparently over."
The Beatles took a flight from Boston, where they performed the night before, to Memphis's Metropolitan Airport and arrived at 1:57 in the afternoon to screaming fans. One teenage fan told a reporter, "I wanted to touch them. I waited 2.5 years for this. I love Jesus and believe in him, and I love the Beatles too." And that, in a nutshell, explains why the ban of of the Beatles was doomed to be of limited scope ultimately. Most teenagers and other fans could easily keep a mental separation from the band and their religious beliefs. The article reported that area hotels and motels were doing brisk business. Others gearing up for an assemblage were a group of Memphis churches who were holding a rally in the city at the same time as the second of two shows the Beatles were performing at 4 and 8:30 p.m. There were also concerns about another group. 3 days prior to the Memphis concert, a KKK group picketed the Beatles concert in Washington, D.C. While it was only 5 robed men marching outside and there were 25,000 fans attending the show, it was an unsettling reminder that tensions were still high for many. The Beatles were genuinely terrified about the Memphis concert specifically. They knew that guns were common in the U.S. and that members of the Klan had made vague threats like that they had ways to stop the Memphis show from taking place. As the Beatles began their 11-song set with rock and roll music during the evening performance in the Mid-South Coliseum, a loud bang was heard. Someone had thrown a firecracker or cherry bomb, causing several injuries. As the band started their second song, She's a Woman, another firecracker exploded on stage near Ringo's feet. John later said of that moment, "Every one of us look at each other because each thought it was the other that had been shot." Audience members pointed out to police officers on hand the people who threw the bombs, a 16-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl. Both boy and girl denied throwing the explosives, but inside the girl's purse, police found 2 bags, one with about 25 cherry bombs and one with about 25 firecrackers. Outside the Coliseum, the KKK was indeed at the Memphis show, picketing outside one of the venue's entrances. There were only 6 Klan members handing out printed material described as anti-Beatle. Reports said that few concert attendees paid them any attention. Meanwhile, the church youth rally across town had a good showing, despite being dwarfed by the crowd over at the Mid-South Coliseum. Actual attendance figures for the religious rally differed among reports, but there was an overflowing audience. Organizers took pains to stress that the event was not anti-anything. They were there to prove that young people will stand up and be counted on the Lord's side. The youths were described as applauding lustily through the tight schedule of singing, testimonies of young people, and 2 30-minute speeches. However, the evening got too outrageous for some, as 30 or so people stormed out of the event as a vocal group called Sing Out Memphis performed a religious song with a beat. One angry father who walked out said, "Many young people were decoyed into going down there for a Christian testimonial service. We might as well have gone to the Coliseum," suggesting that a gospel group using some rhythm is no different than the Beatles' performance taking place about 4.5 miles away. If only this father owned a radio station, he could have banned this outrageous singing group for their heresy of applying rhythm to religious songs. And then he could have announced his ban to the newspapers, saying things like, "I just felt it was so absurd and sacrilegious that something ought to be done to show them that they cannot get away with this sort of thing." You know, just like Tommy Charles of Wacky did 2.5 weeks previously. Most radio stations dropped their bans of the Beatles quietly, some after Lennon's apology, others after the volume of newspaper reports on the ban diminished. It's likely that the true test of the ban was upon the release of the next single by the Beatles. Yellow Submarine, backed with Eleanor Rigby, was issued in the U.S. on August 8th. Yellow Submarine entered the singles chart at number 52 on August 20th and immediately zoomed into the top 10 the following week, peaking at number 2 on September 17th. Eleanor Rigby was simultaneously a top 40 hit, peaking at number 11. The success of both of these songs suggests that the band movement started by Wacky on July 28, 1966, could likely only have caught on in between hit songs by the Fab Four. Paperback Writer had already peaked at number 1 and had dropped out of the top 10 by the time Wacky made an issue of Lennon's comments, so it was an easy time to step off the Beatles' hit train. Among the stations that announced they were unbanning the Beatles was WMOC in Chattanooga. We don't, however, know for how long they banned the group or what made them change their mind. WHWB in Rutland, Vermont announced that they were satisfied with Lennon's apology, prompting one of its DJs to declare during an on-air announcement that the band was over, "The Yellow Submarine sails again." Not the submarine sail, but you get the picture. Not many reporters covered the unbanning with any zeal compared to the banning. An August 17th story from the Associated Press sampled changing opinions among radio stations that banned the group. Stations in Grand Rapids, Dayton, Tulsa, Idaho Falls, and New York City reported dropping their bans after Lennon's apology, while others vowed to continue their ban. Perhaps the longest ban that continued to be enforced was by the South African Broadcasting Corp, which finally ended their ban after after 4 years in 1971. While the Ban the Beatles movement revealed a good deal that was unpleasant or even ugly about American society in 1966, it's important to note that out of 5,500 radio stations across the country, documentation for only around 140 stations banning the group had been found. That's only about 2.5%. And there were many people across the country who could be considered heroes of the period, at least heroes to the pro-Beatles side. A lifeguard named James R. Thomas showed up at the office of the mayor of Huntsville, Alabama, wearing Bermuda shorts and a football jersey to ask for a parade permit in support of the Beatles. The mayor rejected the request, saying that we do not feel that the citizens would appreciate this office authorizing a parade of this nature. Boo to Mayor Glenn Hearn, but cheers to lifeguard James Thomas, who felt the Beatle ban was unfair. 2 American teenagers paid for a classified ad in the UK to announce a Save the Beatles campaign. Susan Dobbs and Teresa Earls of Hopewell, Virginia, were the ones who launched the effort. Their appeal in an ad in the personal column of the Daily Telegraph came as the Ban the Beatles campaign spread to Spain and South Africa, and a new controversy stirred up in Britain. They wrote, "We have a petition to get them back on the air. Please, England, help us. We love them too." The 12-line ad cost them $33.60. That's nearly $350 today after adjusting for inflation. According to the Findlay Republic Courier newspaper,
Dateline, Dayton, Ohio. For the third straight day, teenagers picketed the studios of radio station WONE Sunday, protesting the station's decision not to play any more records by the Beatles. An announcer said about 10 to 15 boys and girls had been marching up and down in front of the studios all day, carrying signs condemning the station's move.
the picketers are laudable not only for actively standing up for their principles, but also because they had to suffer the egregious condescension of the unbylined reporter who wrote this article for the Dayton Daily News.
Eileen Harrison, a pretty 17-year-old, seemed to be leading the pickets yesterday morning. The station managers, she declared, are acting like babies. Everyone should have the right to freedom of speech, Miss Harrison said, and stuff like that, added a long-haired boy at her side. We'd rather fight than switch from the Beatles, said another placard. WONE, get the facts before you act, said another. The Beatles are tops with us, said Jennings Lovins III. That was fairly obvious from the lad's clothing and hairstyle. Asked why she was picketing, 16-year-old Sheila Myers replied, "Because these other kids came and picked me up this morning."
The reporter caps off his obnoxious article with a sarcastic final touch.
Anyway, yesterday was a pleasant day for being outdoors.
The reporter could snark all he wanted, but 2 days after that article, WONE announced they were rescinding their ban. Not every hero of the ban was a supporter of the Beatles, per se. WSAC from Fort Knox, Kentucky had not previously played the Beatles, but when the radio bands started spreading across the country, they did something unexpected. They began playing the Beatles every 30 minutes, along with an editorial denouncing the hypocrisy of other stations banning the group. Its editorial stated, "This is the best way we can think of to show our contempt for hypocrisy personified. Some of the stations which have banned the Beatles records play other songs that are the most pornographic melodies since Elizabethan times. Perhaps the Beatles could become more popular than Jesus, as Beatle John allegedly said. Perhaps that is what is wrong with society, and there they are, dear friend. You made them so. Not Jesus, not John Lennon, and not the Beatles." One John Bartholomew in Fort Worth, Texas, took advantage of anti-Beatles sentiment and ran a classified ad saying, "Attention ex-Beatles fans, don't burn your records. Send them to me." I truly hope he increased his music collection. And finally, senior high school students Alice Mang of Arcadia, California, and Denise Longpre of Monrovia, California, organized BEATLES, which stood for Bureau of Equality, acknowledging the lawful entertainment standards. Their object? To prove that Beatles fans and the Beatles are real people. Their objective? To do a worthwhile public service instead of name-calling, picketing, marching, and troublemaking. They have decided to spend their time making up packages and sending them to needy children in the name of Beatles. That's the acronym Beatles, not the band Beatles. We cannot get back all the smashed Beatle records and then piece them together, they added, but we can do something useful and helpful. Peace and love, folks. Peace and love. The Ban the Beatles movement was a big deal for a couple of weeks in August 1966, enough to become fodder for editorial cartoons. And while it wasn't a new phenomenon that many religious folks had a dim view of the group, the controversy certainly fanned the flames of dislike for them. The antipathy for the Beatles at that time was real, and sometimes really disproportionate. A lot of people didn't like their hair. Some people just hated them. And some people simply thought they were dull and ordinary. for one relatively brief moment after Wacky grabbed some publicity for themselves, all the haters saw a path in August 1966 to try to rid themselves of this meddlesome band from Liverpool, England. A band that had saturated newspapers, TV, and especially the radio for over 2 years. The haters wanted to expose them for the fad that many still believe them to be, increasingly against all evidence. But their gleeful delight in attacking the Beatles no doubt turned sour when the group's U.S. tour wasn't called off. Tickets still sold well for their concerts, and fans were still screaming from the audience. And Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby were soon released as singles, and suddenly the Beatles were everywhere again. A glimmer of hope for the haters emerged when, in the fall of '66, the members of the Fab Four went off on separate projects, and rumors emerged that the band was breaking up during an uncharacteristic period of silence from them. But then Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane hit the charts in late February '67 on their way to both becoming top 10 hits, and then Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in June '67. And while the Beatles didn't last as a group together for many more subsequent years, their music has stood the test of time like few others of their generation, or of most generations. This has been the CHARTstoppers Special Report, Ban the Beatles. I'm Mike Sauter. If you want to read more about individual radio station bands, see the website BeatlesHitList.com.